So, hi everyone, and for those of you that don't know me, I'm Jamie. As well as being CEO at Pathfinders, I also do lots of chaotic and interesting other things, many of which end up overlapping with the theme of campaigning, which is, I suspect, why I was asked to do this session. Um, and I've got some slides, but I'm also very keen to take questions. So if people have questions and are able to either put them in the chat or use the hands up thing, then I will try and take them as we go along. Because I often think conversations like this are more effective as conversations and people get more from them. So I've been campaigning for a very, very long time. I organised my first demonstration at about, I think, 11 or 12, police permission to demonstrate and all, against the Iraq War. Not really sure why I thought that getting sort of 20 people out on Berkhamsted High Street with placards would really make a difference. But I learned from that both that the number of people opposed to something doesn't necessarily make a difference in the short term, but that campaigning isn't just about making the difference you're campaigning for. It's also about working with people and building the networks and communities to campaign into the future. It's not just a win or lose on a single issue thing. And my campaigning has spanned a lot of different things, from occupying university buildings and using my wheelchair to blockade to make sure that security couldn't get in and chuck us out, to sitting around negotiating tables with local and national government. It's put me in rooms with people that I profoundly disagree with, but we found ourselves arguing for the same thing. And it's put me on the opposite side of the table to people where I know that we agree on 98% of what we're doing. It's made me a lot of friends, a lot of connections. It helped me set up my own arts organisation. It helps me a lot with running Pathfinders. And it's also been a way in which I've been able to try and leverage an impact on the world. And I think that's a really big thing about campaigning ultimately, is that it's about how can you identify something that you want to change and then find a way of changing towards it. And how can you build those communities of other people that agree with you? How can you find the people you disagree with? How can you change their minds? And what tools do you have available to you? And those tools can be legal ones. They can be tools of using some degree of physical resistance, blocking buildings, etc. They could be tools like working with the media. Um, there are so many different routes to being a campaigner. And I guess I'm going to kick off with a question for you on what you actually think a campaigner does day to day, because I would be very surprised if people in here weren't already campaigners. So Lauren works in advocacy, and I know isn't the only person here who works in advocacy. And in many ways, advocacy is about, it's both a kind of micro campaigning in which you're supporting people to make the change that they need in their own lives. Because actually, campaigning isn't just about changing policy or a national picture. Sometimes it's about changing something tiny and local. And the other thing about advocacy work is that it can feel like it's individual case by individual case, but actually, as you do it, you're building up a knowledge base that allows you to change things more effectively. And you're also working with people to get the outcomes they want, and hopefully putting them in a position where they can then work with other services to get what they want. Services can learn from you about how to support people to meet the outcomes that they want. And actually, you're not just changing things for that individual, you're hopefully changing it for the service that they work with as well.
I would say another thing about it is that a campaigner is not just a campaigner in their job, but they are a campaigner in their uh, private lives as well. So they don't just keep it in their work life; they take it outside as well.
Yeah, very much so. And I think also, like, the ways that you take it outside can be quite small. So I had an incident, for example, where I was left on a train because no one had turned up with the ramp. So my partner had gotten off to go and find them. They'd started coming with the ramp, and the driver had closed the doors and driven off while they were getting the ramp out. And so I was on my own, quite drunk, on a late night 2-hour round trip, desperate for the toilet. And I went away and I made a complaint and pushed it. And there has now been a policy change that they now put wheelchair users in the accessible carriage by default rather than just wherever, because that way, in theory, you could reach an accessible emergency stop alarm, whereas in other carriages you can't necessarily. And I
Yeah,
hadn't made that complaint thinking of it as campaigning, but
no,
actually it's engineered a real change in the policy in my area.
I think Sarah's written that it involves researching. It involves being a researcher as well.
And that's the thing, campaigning can look like it's the quite loud, fun stuff, whether you're on TV or carrying a placard or whatever. But actually behind that, there's a huge amount of both your own knowledge and research and other people's. So some campaigners are people that want their faces out there, and other campaigners are the people who are doing the research, drafting the letters, holding the meetings, networking, etc., and who prefer to very much remain in the background. Not all campaigners necessarily want to be at the forefront. And if you're campaigning for a cause, you're actually going to need to know a lot about that cause, because otherwise, the minute that you're talking about it to a friend or talking about it on the radio and you get asked a question you can't answer, you're stuck. So a big part of being a campaigner is also being somebody who learns what they need to know. And with my railway incident, the things that I needed to know were it had happened, and also that I'm never asked where on the train I want to go, and I'm often not put in the accessible coach. But if I'd wanted to push it, for example, for national policy change, I might have wanted to do a survey of wheelchair users to find out how many people had had assistance fail to meet their train. I might want to try and get evidence for bad outcomes as a result of that. I might want to try and find out how many people are always put in the accessible coach, where it varies, etc. Because the bigger the change you're pushing for, the more evidence you're going to need. And getting that evidence is a really important part of campaigning. And another important part of it is networking for people, for those of you who are absolute social butterflies, going out there, meeting people, persuading them subtly, getting people involved, etc., is a huge part of campaigning, because it requires a lot more than just the few faces that you actually see. Kath.
I was just going to say that, which links into that awareness raising is what a campaigner does at the very small, to start with. It might be just about making other people aware of something, an issue that you think is causing difficulty to either just yourself or to somebody else. So it's about awareness raising as well.
It is. I think it's particularly about awareness raising with an eye towards change. It's very easy to say, oh, this thing doesn't work. It's a lot harder to say this thing doesn't work, but here's an idea about how it could be better. And for me, that's kind of the difference between a complainer and a campaigner, is that a campaigner has an idea of what they want to achieve that's better. And sometimes what's better is so-and-so need to stop doing such and such. That an end to something is very much a campaignable outcome. But that campaigning is also about providing examples of how things could change and could be, not just about the problems that there are now. So I grabbed a bunch of screenshots from different campaigning things that I'd done over the past while, from they say sit-in, I say occupation. We were there for about 2 weeks outside the principal's office at my university, campaigning against the tuition fee rises. We clearly didn't win. That's where the free education now tax the rich placard picture comes from as well. The student fees demonstrations of 2010 to 2012. And those are both the sit-in. We knew that we could be arrested, but we thought it was reasonably unlikely. the protests, I made decisions that made me unlikely to be arrested, whereas I have friends who made decisions knowing they'd be arrested, which is very courageous and not my area of strength. But then other types of campaigning, the article that I wrote about public transport for The Guardian back in, well, that says 5 years old, then helped me get a job with my local council, researching the experiences of deaf and disabled people across the borough, which has got the outcome of they're creating a job within the council specifically for co-production with disabled communities and funding the starting up of a new disabled people's organisation. And a lot of that came from things like writing that Guardian article. When I wrote that, I hadn't done anything really. I might have done an assisted suicide article for them. I can't remember which way round that went, but I literally wrote to them and pitched it and said, you know, this is what happened. Please take an article from me on it. And they did. And then I wrote it and they published it. And it was that simple, because actually for places like The Guardian, you can pitch an article whenever you want. My other Guardian one there is a letter I wrote in about the casting of someone non-disabled as a disabled character. And I wrote that in about 15 minutes and sent it to Letters at The Guardian, and it got published. And the more of these kinds of things you do, the more you raise your profile as a campaigner. Then the assisted dying interview I did on Sky News, that one was brilliant because there were 2 wheelchair users and we disagreed. But at least there were 2 of us. It wasn't me and someone non-disabled, usually Lord Falconer, who is a nightmare to debate against and wiped the floor with me the first time we tried. It was humiliating. The other one is from an interview I did supporting the striking junior doctors, even though my procedure had been cancelled. Now, the Sky News one on assisted suicide, I got because I'm involved in a campaign organisation. The one on the junior doctors strike, I got because I've done some media training with an organisation called Neon, who train left-wing commentators and then pitch them out on news stories. So I was offered a news story this afternoon, but it clashed with a meeting. And I get maybe every couple of weeks the opportunity to do something on something disability related. I did some on the changes to PIP a little while ago. So there's lots and lots of different things you can do as a campaigner. And I think there's 2 really interesting comments in the chat. Haley noting that it's amazing how many companies don't know the issues their customers are facing. And Lauren noting that, like, you raise issues and nothing is done about it. And I think in terms of companies knowing, the problem is that the complaints and compliments team often don't have any real way to feed back and make change. So often when you're trying to tell a company what's working, social media may get traction. Trying to Google for the email addresses of more senior staff could often get a lot more traction. And what Lauren said about raising issues and nothing being done about it, it's incredibly disheartening. I think there are strategies you can use. One of them is to start with a complaint and a remedy. So you say, I wasn't able to visit your shop because you don't have a portable ramp that you could put and you have a single step. You know, this is breach of equalities legislation and your anticipatory requirement to make reasonable adjustments. As a remedy, I expect you to purchase an appropriate ramp and have your staff trained in using it within the next 8 weeks. And then if they haven't done that in 8 weeks' time, you can send what's called a letter before action, which is a polite way of saying, I am going to sue you for breach of the Equality Act. The great thing about a letter before action is that it doesn't oblige you to take action. So you can send a letter before action, and that will often make them pay attention because of the risk of being sued, even if you're not actually planning to do it. And taking someone to court over failure to make reasonable adjustments is complicated and risky, and I've never done it for that reason. But you don't have to do it to make them think that you might and to get them to change things. And yeah, I mean, the listed building argument is complicated. I've done a lot of work with listed buildings on adaptation, but temporary ramps and things can always be used. It's only permanent adaptations that are more complicated. and I have a lot of issues with the listed building system. Sam, you're on mute.
I was going to say about companies that sort of hide behind legislation, even if they're sort of protected by legislation. I was wondering, so the way to deal with that would be to go up to the sort of local government, your local MP about it. I guess if it's to do with sort of a building regulation legislation issue.
If it's building regulations, often your council is a better place to look than your MP.
Yeah.
Because often you can try and get round it with the planning committee
Hmm.
and argue it that way.
Yeah.
Generally, though, I find at that point that going to the media is often the best option, particularly if you can package up a really sympathetic story of this is me, this is my condition, this is the very reasonable thing I wanted to do, this is how they stopped me, this is how it's illegal, this is all I want them to do, and they're refusing to do it.
Yeah.
And in terms of what it means to be a campaigner, for me, it's about finding the thing that you want to change, working out how to change it, and working with people to change it. I mean, you can be a campaigner without the last one. You can be a campaigner on your own. I've never found that to be particularly effective. I've always found it a lot better if I found people to work with. But being a campaigner doesn't require you to go to protests and demonstrations, to like public speaking, to be good at networking, or to break the law. Those are all things that campaigners can do, but they're not things that campaigners have to do. And there's lots of room to campaign while doing those things, but also lots of room to campaign while not doing those things. And in terms of the ways in which we campaign, there are lots of different, I guess, types of campaign as well. So a sort of awareness raising campaign is about saying, this is an issue and we want people to change how they do it. Can anyone think of an awareness raising campaign, that particularly one that's been quite successful recently? So there have been lots of campaigns that I've noticed recently about things. So campaigns like Copperfield, which is about encouraging people with breasts to check for lumps even when they're young, rather than assuming that they won't develop breast cancer while young. There've been some really good campaigns around encouraging people to do tests for bowel cancer once they hit the right age. There have been fewer around cervical cancer, which I suspect the fact that there have been fewer of those campaigns probably has its roots in misogyny. But certainly those have been campaigns that have caught my eye recently. There have also been a lot of kind of awareness raising ones about women in sport that I've noticed, which aren't necessarily calling for a specific outcome, but they are raising the profile of women's sports in ways that are designed to encourage more people to engage with and attend women's sporting events. Sam?
I was going to say about quite a lot of in the media is the support for Palestine and those marches. And I'm looking at this, I'm guessing that is kind of both a lobbying campaign and an awareness raising one. It's a bit of both, I would say.
Yeah, I think because it's partly trying to get wider society to be aware of what is happening,
Yeah.
and partly about trying to influence the political process for change. Yeah, Sarah's also said Signs of a Stroke campaign. That's been a really good one. There's been another good one about sepsis. Again, a lot of these are medical, which is interesting. Lobbying campaigns. So a really obvious effective lobbying campaign at the moment, I would say, is the assisted dying campaign. They're doing really well. They've got a really neat schedule by which every few weeks a new news story or celebrity comes out in favour of it. They have a good body of evidence from lots of other countries. I mean, I think it's a horrendous body of evidence because I fundamentally disagree with them, but I think they're running an exceptionally well-run, very slick lobbying campaign. Has anyone seen any other good lobbying campaigns recently that have been primarily about getting laws changed? Rights on Flights, says Lauren. Yeah, they're doing really good stuff. I would say that it's not exactly legal change isn't the whole of what they need, though it's part of it. I'd say part of it, it's also almost an advocacy campaign because it's trying to change policy and society as well. Kath?
Having changing places toilets recently had policy changed about large scale buildings having to have a change places toilet installed. New
I think
ones.
that was a little while ago, but yeah, that was a successful lobbying campaign. And then political campaigns. Obviously, every politician is running a campaign because they want to get elected. I think the Brexit campaign is an obvious example of a successful campaign. Again, I'm not saying I agree with it by identifying it, but they set out what they wanted. They worked from well before the UK joined the EU until it got the UK out of the EU. So that was decades of hard work and a very effective campaign, which knew things like it doesn't matter if we build our campaign on lies as long as enough people believe the lies, which is how it was successful to some extent, I think. This is obviously a biased perspective because I'm very opposed to Brexit, but you didn't invite a campaigner to get an unbiased perspective on things. Another effective political campaign at the moment, I would say, is Respect UK, who have emerged to the right of the Tory party. They're getting a lot of seats. They're doing well at what they're doing. Fundraising campaigns. Can anyone think of a really effective fundraising campaign at the moment? The one I had in mind for this was the Rob Burrow Marathon. Yeah, Haley's identified gender reform, and there's a lot of campaigning from a lot of different angles and sides at the moment there. I wouldn't necessarily say any of it is being done spectacularly well as a well-organized campaign. But that there's a lot of, and that's very much lobbying and advocacy because it's both trying to influence legal change but also social change.
An old one would be the ice bucket challenge.
Yeah, the ice bucket challenge was a great example of a really successful fundraising campaign. And then the Rob Burrow Marathon as a more recent one. Both raised huge amounts of money. And again, both were quite medical related. And I think that's because it's really easy to campaign for a cure. It's such a simple message. And when you're campaigning, what you want is a really simple message. So what you want is, we want to leave the EU, not we agree that the EU is a flawed body, but we think it is better to remain within it, given that we can affect these bits of change. Far easier just to say, we want to leave it. And that's a far easier campaign slogan. Ditto, cure muscular dystrophy is easier to campaign and raise funds for than help people with muscle weakening conditions lead full and independent lives. And that's something about campaign messaging as well. And Rights on Flights is a really obvious one for me for an advocacy campaign because it's doing a lot of the media engagement, it's doing a lot of the influencing, it's doing the political work, it's kind of bringing lots of different things together to try and affect change. Because ultimately with campaigning, to some extent, legislative change is only going to be really effective if it follows societal change, not the other way around. When legislative change goes ahead of societal change, you then end up with a huge amount of back and forth trying to work out what people actually believe and want. So thinking about this for people that are here, what do you reckon you've done to try and make change?
I'm thinking of some small ones and maybe would you say something as small as sort of sharing so someone else's campaign is a small change, not a big change, but it's a small change and it's sort of helping them with their message.
Definitely. Like if you see a campaign and you support it on social media, I can't remember the exact amount of fundraising that's equivalent to, but some things have calculated that sharing a post is worth, I think, about a £10 to £15 donation.
Mhm.
So similarly with campaigning, like sharing things is a huge part of helping them. Lauren fights councils day in, day out. I spend part of my time fighting councils and part of my time working with councils. What else have people here done to try and make change?
Radio interview.
Yep.
About a relevant topic, something that's current, when they're trying to get people that might be affected by a change or something like that. Just letting people know about how it's affecting you.
Sharing your story is a really important part of making change. And so Haley said campaign to get access to Ristaplam in Scotland. Sarah has campaigned on blue badge parking at a station. I think you won, Sarah. The APCOA now lets you register nationally for blue badge parking for free blue badge parking at stations, as I discovered recently. My mother, bless her, got some disabled parking bays installed on the seafront at Seaford after about 3 years of working. She's very proud of her parking bays. She took me to see them.
It could be something as small as getting a drop curb installed.
Kath, calling getting a dropped curb installed small is a bold move.
Oh, I'm quite impressed then. I managed to do it once.
It, again in Seaford, it took me about 18 months to get them to agree to change one.
Okay, so I suppose my experience was when you said earlier about campaigning, not complaining. So I spent a lot of time complaining that there was no drop curb for me to get to the front of my house. There was a workman doing the path, so I just went up and approached him and said, "Could you please put a drop curb in there?" They said, "Oh, this is the person at the council you need to get in touch with." So I went and got in touch with them. The next day, they came and put the drop curb in.
That's really impressive. And I think
not
also,
complain.
Indeed, but also shows the value of networking, that to make a campaign effective, you've got to be talking to the right people and to the people that are capable of making that change. And if the people you talk to can't affect the change that you want changing, then it's not going to work. So Sarah also did an interview with local news about closure of the Independent Living Fund. And again, that's also about, that was in many ways not a successful campaign, despite everyone's hard work, because they did close the Independent Living Fund. But without those campaigners, would the funding that was sent to councils have been ring-fenced for as long? Not necessarily. Like, often as a campaigner, you look at the campaign you're doing and you think, well, we failed. I think, well, we didn't get free tuition. We didn't get free higher education. But it's also about thinking, well, what might have happened if we hadn't been campaigning? And the idea, part of the concept of that is that there's a sort of window of reasonable actions. And that when you're campaigning about something, let's say you're campaigning against the changes to make personal independence payments a voucher system. That's not exactly what they're talking about doing, but as a simplified version. It might be that they went ahead and made personal independence payments a voucher system, but because of your campaigning, they had a really long list of things you could get vouchers for and reclaim, and it was really flexible. Whereas otherwise it might have been more like, here is a magazine, you can order these things from it up to this value once. That you don't necessarily see, if you didn't get the thing you were campaigning for, what the worst outcome avoided might be, because actually what you're trying to do is change the window of reasonable action. So when you say it is completely unreasonable to do this, it makes it harder for them to then come up with the harshest version they can think of at their end. And one of the ways that you can effectively do that as a campaigner is by having two groups of campaigners, and one group are in the room and the other group are out of the room. and you work together, you decide what you want. So changing places toilets, let's say, you could run a campaign where outside the room there was a group of very loud, angry wheelchair users who said every new building, whether private or public, if it has a toilet, has to have a changing places toilet, however small. And that's your outside the room, really loud campaigners. And then inside the room, negotiating with government, departments, etc., you have people saying, well, you know, those people demanding a changing places toilet everywhere do have a point, but what about, you know, maybe if you agree that all buildings over a certain size, let's say all medium and above buildings, have to have a changing places toilet, if you don't agree to that, we'll go and join them and you might get what they want. Whereas now we're in the room being reasonable, and you would really rather deal with us than them, wouldn't you? And that's a kind of inside-outside strategy that works so well. And both sides actually know that if you've got a shop that it has a 10-meter square shop, it's not going to fit a changing places toilet in. It's just not. But that if you hadn't had those people outside campaigning and you'd only had the people in the room saying, well, you know, we need them in all medium-sized buildings, then the response from the government would have been, well, that's completely unreasonable. We'll agree to some large-sized buildings, but that's it. That what you want to do is make sure that the outcome that you're at, the outcome you actually expect to be able to get, your best plausible outcome, looks like it's the one in the middle, not the one towards one end. And I guess, so thinking about that, what kind of skills do you think being a good campaigner requires? Feel free to just shout out.
I would say patience and perseverance.
And communication.
Yeah.
Tenacity.
Flexibility.
What
Like,
about
I
being
have,
able to take risks? Or is that not?
sorry?
And be able to take risks.
Yeah, definitely. Strategy, as Haley said. So some of the things I've been talking about there about how you coordinate a campaign are very strategy based. And nobody has to have all of these campaigns. One of the networking, one of the things I'm good at is jumping into a radio interview on something with 5 minutes prep time. One of the things I'm really bad at is keeping track of all of the moving parts of a campaign. Assertiveness, says Sarah, and I am terrible at interpersonal assertiveness. I am really terrible at it. Have to do it by writing, in person. I'm sorry I got in your way. Is about my limit.
Confidence, I guess, is quite important as well.
Yeah.
Knowledgeable about the topic you're campaigning about.
Yeah.
Area.
Ability, I'd say, to build allegiances with people even when you don't agree on everything.
Mm.
This is one of the challenges for people who are currently campaigning against assisted suicide legislation. In that there are lots of different groups of people campaigning against it. And another of the groups is a very religion-based approach. And it's often framed as a debate between the religious opposition to assisted suicide and the kind of humanist being in favour of it, where disabled people's organisations are having to balance it really carefully to be like, we're not doing, you know, we're not opposed to it for religious reasons. So how closely do you work with those organisations, particularly when organisations that take a religious opposition to assisted suicide often also take a religious opposition to, say, abortion, which we're very much in favour of. So then it's, you know, to what extent do you work with people and to what extent don't you? Haley said self-care, which is vital. But I think the other side of that is care for others as well, that you know how to look after yourself, but you also know how to look after the people you're working with. And in terms of running an effective campaign, and fast track to treatments was one that struck me as a good example there, at least for an image. Like, can people think of a campaign that worked?
I've got a really old one, Jamie. Batteries not included. It was the MD UK campaign to get power chairs available on the NHS.
Yeah, that was clearly successful. I say, looking at my NHS power chair. And I think there's also something about actually a slight failure in that Kath said that, and I was desperately trying to remember whether it was the wheelchair one or the ventilator one. And so when I say a slight failure, what I mean is that I think part of campaigning is also about legacy and about making sure that the next generation of people know that we've got it because you campaigned for it.
Mm-hmm.
Like wheelchair spaces on buses, we've got those because people like, people like Liz Carr, and that generation of activists chained themselves to buses. If we can't go on it, why should it go at all? And I think it's really important with a campaign that's won to kind of keep its name alive so that people know that campaigning works and so that people know that campaigning made that change.
Would you say the Me Too movement as well, or is that that's still kind of ongoing at the moment?
But I would say it's affected a huge amount of societal change.
Mm-hmm.
It's really revolutionized how gender-based violence is talked about. For example, if you look at I don't know his name, I'll be honest, the awful Spanish football man that forcibly kissed a female player at the World Cup, he may go to prison for this. And pre-Me Too, the idea of that would have been inconceivable. Tenancy deposit schemes, says Sarah, which were campaigned for by Citizens Advice and which have made a huge difference to people in rented accommodation.
Sorry, Jamie.
Go for it, Kath.
I was going to say This Girl Can. That was a bit of a forerunner campaign for women's football. And you've got to see it to be it, but This Girl Can campaign.
And I think the thing is that often when a campaign has been successful, part of the way it's successful is that the problem goes or the problem lessens and then we kind of forget about it. And actually, most of the rights we have were campaigned for. Independent living, for example, direct payments were the results of huge amounts of campaigning. And I think it's easy to see campaigns that didn't work, but actually to not realize how much of what we have is a result of ones that did. And so then thinking about a successful campaign, the first thing is to be like, what are you actually campaigning for? What's the problem? So what's wrong? Who does it affect? Why does it matter? What's the background context? So do you have data, examples, human stories? What are the risks if the problem isn't dealt with? Then what are potential solutions? What can be done by whom and when? Have these worked in the past? How would they be implemented? And those are really good questions to answer when you're starting to think about changing something. So, for example, with wheelchair access in a listed building, the problem is that wheelchair users can't get in to visit this fancy restaurant in a listed building. Here are 2 stories of wheelchair users who were disappointed. Here's some data on how many buildings aren't accessible. What are the risks? Obviously, further disappointment on the one side, but also potential legal action. What can be done? A portable ramp could be built. Could be bought. Here are examples of where portable ramps have worked. And that's really, really simple and basic. Sarah, will you go about to say something?
No, sorry, I've knocked it off mute. Sorry about that.
No worries. And then the other side of that is also who do you need to engage? Because actually, there's no point in campaigning for change if you're talking to the wrong people. So you want to kind of find out who's going to agree with you, who would support you and why. So let's say instead you're campaigning for lifts for a footbridge over a railway line, then actually local groups of elderly people, local parents who have buggies, local shops that are near the railway line because people have to carry their shopping over the footbridge. Those would all be potential supporters. Elderly people, any community venues near said railway line, because again, in those community venues, people are going to be carrying stuff from one side to the other and attending, and they're more likely to be people who would be more likely to need lifts. So immediately it goes far beyond wheelchair users and into lots of other populations of people as well. And so then it's thinking, well, how can you work with them and how can you engage them? But also, who's the opposition? And the opposition there, it might be just National Rail, which says, well, you know, we've got a plan to put a lift in 16 years' time because it's in tier 3 of our footbridge lift building plan. And their concern is, say, budget. But can you show them that the legal risk of not doing it would cost more? Can you show them that the reputational risk of not doing it would cost more? Can you show them that there are lower budget ways of making an accessible railway crossing there? Can you show them that they're planning to put lifts in phase 3 for 3 footbridges, all of which are about 10 minutes apart from each other? So why not put a lift in for one of the middle one and delay the other 2 a bit longer? You know, what can you do to know what their concerns are and then to address their concerns? And then once you've done that, you've got to think about how to actually create a winning campaign. And you want your really clear core message. And that's why pure muscular dystrophy is a lot easier to fundraise for than support adults with muscular dystrophy to lead independent and fulfilling lives. It's a really easy slogan. People think, oh, it looks awful. I think it should be cured. Yes, I'll support that. And then it's working out who your target audience is. So who's going to actually be able to make the change and how do you get those people on side? And human stories are a big part of that. That really sympathetic example can make a huge difference, as can the research. It's also choosing the right way of protesting. You know, for that railway footbridge, having a protest at rush hour at the station could be very effective. But if what you want is funding towards a cure, you may be more effective either trying to raise money or trying to influence change at the NHS buying end or the pharmaceutical development end. Then obviously getting media attention is a huge part of it. And so that's about having influential people and, you know, famous faces. But influential people aren't necessarily famous faces. Sometimes they are Kath's workman, who was influential because he knew exactly who to contact and get it sorted. And then it's about having a really clear brand and visual identity. So what you're campaigning for is really recognizable and obvious. And that doesn't necessarily mean like expensive branding. It might just mean that you're using the same language to talk about it each time so that people really understand what those words mean and how they relate. Planning it all, knowing what timelines you're doing things on, when you're releasing content, what you want to do and when, really. And that's about the perseverance as well and about being settled in for the long run. And then also being able to change and shift and take opportunities. And that's something that I think the assisted dying campaign is really good at. Is that like they're very good at spotting a slight change or a slight opportunity and diving on it. But then I will say that's probably partly because they've got lots of people who are funded to work for them. And they've got a lot of focus on this. And then kind of at the end of your winning campaign or your losing campaign, it's also like, what next? And that's about knowing that you won't achieve everything. So what are you going to be happy with? How are you going to keep people engaged and involved and enthusiastic? How are you going to keep those communities of campaigners going? How are you going to remind people that, like that saying, you know, we might have lost the battle, but not the war? That when Brexit happened, the battle for the UK to stay part of the EU was lost. But was the end goal for the UK to be part of the EU? Or was the end goal strong European integration in the absence of wars on the continent? And if it's the latter, then you can see that Brexit was a loss of a battle, but not necessarily the loss of the war, because there are lots of other campaigns and lots of other ways and lots of other things to look forward. And even though some things are unsuccessful, other things might be, and you never know the influence it'll happen. And I had planned to leave about 10 minutes for questions, which I have successfully done. So I am going to stop sharing my screen so that we can all see each other a bit better, and ask if anyone has any thoughts, questions, or comments.
Thanks, Jamie. If you just stick your hand up if you've got a question, or put it in the chat. And while we're waiting for you to think. Oh, Aidan.
Was it hard for you to get into campaigning and that?
Hard for me to get into campaigning?
Yeah.
Not really. Like, what did I do to get into campaigning? Some of it was just the kind of the student protest at university stuff. Some of it was things like using social media to campaign about things that mattered. Some of it was just brightly writing things, to sending things off to the Guardian and seeing if they took any of them. And they usually didn't, but occasionally they did.
Okay.
So for me, it was also like, it was about, I think what I did have to do was identify the causes that I was going to focus on, because there's actually loads and loads and loads of things to care about changing in the world, but everyone has limited energy. And actually it's about thinking, where can you be most effective, and what do you most want to change, finding out who's already doing things, and then starting by supporting their work, getting to know them. So I started out by just like boosting things that Not Dead Yet, which is the anti-assisted suicide campaign run by disabled people, was doing. I joined their Facebook group. I commented there. I like wrote letters in, and I developed it from there, knowing that for me that was one of my priorities. Do I think it is the single biggest threat facing disabled people right now? No. Do I think that we've all got limited energy and need to spread ourselves out across lots of different important issues? Yes. And so that was one of the issues that I landed on.
Jamie, do you have a campaign that you would like to be involved with, but for whatever reason you haven't been?
I would like to be, specifically, I would like to be doing more of a kind of networking based campaigning, looking at where the UK disability arts sector can support the Palestinian disability arts sector. And I haven't had the capacity to do that work, but it's something that I've been kind of plugging away at a bit in the background when I've got bits of time, and talking to people who are doing bits of that work and looking at how more could be done. So that's something that I would like to be involved in, but I'm not. I think a lot of the, like, I've only ever tangentially supported things like the Changing Places campaign, which I think is brilliant, but I've also seen that that's going really well. And so I do quite a lot of like Changing Places advocacy and like pushing for them. We're getting some more built in Lewisham as a result, etc. But I don't do any of the hard national work on that. Also because I can see that there are lots of other people doing it.
Is that you, Jackie, with a question?
Yes. If you could go back to the beginning of your campaigning journey, what is one piece of advice that you wish you knew sooner about campaigning?
I'm not going to go back to the very beginning because that was my little anti-Iraq war campaign. I think so. About 7 odd years ago, I ended up doing a Sky News debate on assisted suicide, where Lord Faulkner was the person in favour and I was the person opposed. And I did it because nobody else on the Not Dead Yet Facebook group was available. And I didn't do my research well enough. So I was out-facted. I didn't go into it prepared. I've now learned that you need to go into a media interview knowing what you're planning to say, regardless of what they ask you. Whereas I just try to answer their questions, which doesn't work, because actually that lets them control it. What you need to do is go into it knowing exactly what you want to say. So I would say really that, like, the bit of advice is do your research and know your material before you go into anything. Don't think that because you believe in it, that's enough. And doing your research might just be being able to speak about your experience, but then you want to know how to describe your experience quickly, efficiently, convincingly, rather than rambling for 6 hours about your story while everyone gets bored.
As a follow-on question from Jackie, if you could going back to when you first started campaigning, or a little bit later, if you could go on any training course, what would that be to help with campaigning?
I think when I first started, I'm going to put in just a plug for something like the UpLift Residential, actually, because going to that was would have been a chance to meet other people that cared about similar things, find out what they'd pushed for, find out what had been successful, make friends, build those networks, learn about campaigning and making change. And that would have been a really, that's the kind of thing that I think I would have really benefited from at the beginning. Like, more recently, I went on a brilliant media skills training. And I think for anyone who wants to do media skills training is really, really useful and valuable. But actually, I think the first part of it is about building those networks, meeting other people, finding out what they do, finding out what's been successful, and learning from other people facing similar problems. And that's what makes the residential so great.
Well, thank you ever so much, Jamie. It's been really brilliant to hear about your journey. There's so much involved in campaigning, so I'm really impressed that you managed to get it into an hour as well. So thank you very much. Yeah, it's brilliant.